And now we begin Conflicts that Shaped Pharaonic Egypt. Lecture 1, Forgetting and Rediscovering Ancient Egypt.
The civilization we know as ancient Egypt, the time of the first pharaohs, began over 5,000 years ago. From its very beginning, pharaonic culture, religion, and scripts were inextricably linked. By the Greco-Roman period, and more specifically during the roughly 7 centuries straddling the change of eras, the knowledge of pharaonic civilization was in the hands of a dwindling number of priests who could still read and compose texts in the ancient native Egyptian writing systems. Even our modern name Egypt appears to derive through the Greek Aegyptos from the ancient Egyptian Hut-Kap-Ptah, the domain of the Ka spirit of Ptah, a name for the temple of the creator deity of the area of ancient Memphis, near modern Cairo. Religion and cultural identity for the ancient Egyptians were concepts inextricably linked. The death of the unbroken line of educated scribes and priests who formed the collective memory of pharaonic Egypt is tied to the end of pagan worship and the rise of Christianity in Egypt. When knowledge of the ancient writing systems vanished, when the last in the long line of the ancient priests died out, all direct contact between the later world and the earlier pharaonic civilization was broken and lost until the modern period. By the late 1st century after Christ, at least some of the ancient Egyptian priests were very well aware that their numbers were dwindling and their funds of knowledge were coming to an end. They knew they were seeing the birth of our era and the end of all that had gone before. Egyptian funerary inscriptions for millennia asked that literate passers-by read them and pronounce formulae that provided for the continued nourishment of the dead in the netherworld. In the usual closing address to the living, as we call it, on a hieroglyphic stela of a priest from Middle Egypt, the middle portion of the country, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, around about AD 125, one particularly learned Egyptian priest asked those passing by his monument to do something other than simply say formulae for the continued nourishment of his soul. And what he said was, "Set your hearts on what is in the text of the stela. Do not forget the text collections. Make copies of them and stick perfectly to the text." This man, who lived in the 2nd century of our era, this ancient Egyptian priest, knew that he was one of the last living people who really had a firm grasp on the 3 millennia and more of writing and knowledge that the ancient Egyptians had recorded. By chance, the last hieroglyphic inscription for which we know the date was carved in the portico of that very Emperor Hadrian, behind the west tower of the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, at the very southern border of Egypt, in the city of Aswan. The inscription was not recorded during the reign of Hadrian, but about 270 years later, written on the 24th of August, AD 394, addressed by a local southern priest, not to one of the great, old, well-known gods of Egypt, but to the strange local southern god Mandulus. During the reign of Hadrian, a priest feared the coming loss of knowledge and in the portal of Hadrian on the island of Philae in AD 394, that knowledge finally began to flicker out. About 50 years later, during the middle of the 5th century of our era, the last datable inscription in the cursive Egyptian script, Demotic, was written, and at that point, the earliest and still longest-lived writing system on Earth, the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic and cursive scripts, became a forgotten relic. Loss of knowledge of the script, the loss of the ability to read the ancient inscriptions, was quickly followed by the loss of knowledge of the religious cult. This flickering out of the ancient religion, this death of the old gods, was the last point of any direct descent of knowledge coming out of ancient Egypt. Loss of knowledge of the ancient scripts was quickly followed by the loss of the religious cult, the last of any direct line of descent of knowledge out of ancient Egypt. The Emperor Theodosius I closed the temples of Egypt and issued an edict for the formal Christianization of the country. Not long afterwards, in AD 452, just about the time the last Demotic inscription was written, the Emperor Marcian oversaw the defeat of the Isis-worshipping tribes called the Blemis and Nobatai in Nubia, the land south of Egypt. Although the terms of the Nubian surrender were generally humiliating, the Romans allowed those last venerators of Egypt's old gods to visit the island of Philae once a year and borrow the statue of the goddess Isis. However, in AD 540, the Empress Theodora dispatched a missionary to convert the king of the Nobatai to Christianity. Already ignorant of the ancient scripts, the middle of the 6th century CE saw the conversion of the last of an unbroken line of adherents to cults whose origins we dimly glimpse in art and iconography over 5 millennia earlier. With the death of the priesthood, following hard on the heels of the death of the ancient scripts, any direct understanding, any organic comprehension of Egyptian civilization had ended. Early in March of AD 641, Byzantine forces in the fortress of Babylon near modern Cairo ignominiously surrendered to the Arab forces under Amr, general of the Prophet Muhammad, and the curtain of Islam descended over much of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Egyptian language continued. The last phase of the language, which we call Coptic, was the language and is the liturgical language of the Coptic Christian Church. But by about AD 1000, Coptic Egyptian was probably no longer a living, daily spoken language, but already a fossilized liturgical tongue. By about AD 1400, we have the last truly productive writing composed in Coptic, the great poem called the Triadan. And at that point, the history of the Egyptian language comes to an end. The distracted people of the former Western Roman Empire were busy in the construction of the states of Europe, and they and the embattled Byzantines turned their attentions to stopping the march of Islam. Egypt continued to contribute to the world, notably in terms of Christian monasticism, Cenobitic monasticism as we call it, based to a great extent on the writings of the great Christian Coptic theologian Pachomius. But for centuries upon centuries, Egypt was a mystery to the Western world. speaking only through monuments. Now, with the loss of the knowledge of how to read the ancient Egyptian scripts, ancient Egypt's speech became quite garbled. Even through the time of the Renaissance, many of the best-known Egyptian monuments in Europe were in fact Roman copies or products of Roman Egyptomania, hybrid productions of classical and pharaonic styles. And these hybrid creations retained a great influence up until the early 19th century. The Christian states of medieval Nubia and Christian Ethiopia beyond produced the legend of Prester John, a hope of Christian states turning the flank of Islam, but they contributed nothing to the West's understanding of the great and now rapidly buried civilization of ancient Egypt. Even before the coming of Islam, even before the final complete death of the ancient scripts, the Egyptians themselves, as members of a Christian Byzantine Roman Empire, developed a peculiar and one might say schizophrenic understanding of their own past. As one can see from frescoes in the so-called Exodus Chapel in a Christian mausoleum in Kharga Oasis out in the western desert of Egypt, an Egyptian Christian artist depicted scenes from the book of Exodus in the Bible. This Egyptian artist in the western desert depicts the liberated Israelites as Byzantines, a great Byzantine Christian force, and showed the pursuing pharaonic Egyptians, the enemies in the story chasing the children of Israel. This artist depicted the pharaonic Egyptians, his or her own ancestors, roughly in the guise of the Persian enemies of the Roman Empire of the time. After the death of antiquity, references to Egypt were known to educated people in the Western world through classical authors, biblical passages, and the few surviving, albeit rarely read, writings of a handful of true Roman Egyptian priests, like the priest Karaman. Around the time of the Hohenstaufen Renaissance in 13th century Italy, some actual copying of Egyptian monuments did occur, a type of early medieval Egyptomania. But none of this is more than a recreation of the distorted view of ancient Egypt filtered through classical authors, biblical accounts, and those Roman copies of Egyptian art. Matters begin to change during the 16th century. The Ottoman Turks, who had seized control of the Eastern Roman Empire and most of the lands of Islam, suffered major reversals in the Mediterranean. As the result of a disastrous attempt to take Malta from the Knights of St. John in 1565, and following the catastrophic defeat of the Ottoman fleet by the forces of the Holy League at Lepanto on the 7th of October 1571, the Ottoman Empire lost effective control of much of the Mediterranean. Now, no Eastern Mediterranean power, Islam, Byzantium, or Venice, could keep Western interests and Western tourists away. On one Turkish vessel captured after the Battle of Lepanto, the conquering Christian forces found a mummy, apparently taken on by the Turks as loot or as a talisman, and this mummy promptly was depicted as one of the major objects in a book from 1574. Lepanto officially opens the East to more common and less martial Western activity, and Malta will appear again soon at the true birth of Egyptology. Now, what, you may ask, happened to the script? During the early Renaissance, a Florentine traveler on the Greek island of Andros discovered the work of a man named Horapolon. Although found in 1419, the text originally dates to the 5th century. the time of that final death of the ancient Egyptian scripts. The man has a composite name, Horus Apollo, part Egyptian, part classical, just like those Egyptianizing monuments throughout the Roman Empire. This man, Horapolon, actually could understand some of the hieroglyphic script. He gives proper values for a number of hieroglyphs, so the goose writes sun, but he invents imaginative derivations for that value. Goose means sun because phonetically, sa, written with the sign of the goose, means sun. But for Horapolon, no, the goose writes the concept of sun because the goose is such a good parent. These imaginative, thematic cryptographic explanations for the values of Egyptian signs, this idea that Egyptian hieroglyphs transcend the phonetic concepts, the phonetic values of any particular language, this idea that they write some divine, almost pre-phonetic language, did much to throw off a great many people who might have made greater progress in trying to understand the language. Poor copies did not help either. Now, during the 17th century, the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher tried to translate ancient Egyptian. But he, thanks to Horapolon and others, was caught in elaborate mythic meanings. Kircher knew Horapolon well and believed what he said much too unquestioningly. Nevertheless, Kircher, who saw all knowledge as expressions of a holistic theophany, bridges mysticism as a living thing in the West and the more cold, accurate documentation and reconstructions of the late Renaissance and the Baroque period. Kircher's efforts are Herculean and entirely bizarre, and they probably did more to lead others astray than did the strange explanations of Horapolon. Kircher translated what we now know to be the name of King Apries, a ruler of the 26th dynasty, on the Piazza Minerva obelisk in Rome. Rather than reading the name of Apries, Kircher read, quote, "The protection of Osiris against the violence of Typhon is to be obtained by means of the proper rites and ceremonies, by sacrifices and by appeal to the tutelary geniuses of the tripartite world, in order to ensure the enjoyment of the prosperity customarily given by the Nile against the violence of the enemy Typhon." End quote. The inscription actually consists of 5 signs, writing the prenomen, the name Ha'ib Ra, may the heart of Re rejoice. A religious expression, true, but not a lengthy disquisition on Typhon. Nevertheless, in his defense, Athanasius Kircher is the father of modern Western study of the Coptic, Christian phase of the Egyptian language and scripts. In 1636, Kircher actually demonstrated that Coptic was ancient Egyptian, the spoken ancient Egyptian language, written primarily in Greek characters. Had Kircher but realized that the hieroglyphs also wrote that tongue, often phonetically, he would have presaged the great insight of Champollion, the true translator of ancient Egyptian, by almost 2 centuries. Unfortunately, Kircher would still have dealt with very imperfect copies, many prepared by himself, at a time when the value of a true facsimile copy was not so well appreciated. Just under 2 centuries later, the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, profiting from his knowledge of Coptic, popularized in the West by none other than Athanasius Kircher, and with the advantage of good copies and actual ancient Egyptian inscriptions, not Greco-Roman copies, cracked the system of ancient Egyptian scripts. Egypt might have remained obscure for many more years, were it not for one man who arrived with such a force of soldiers and scholars that he can be said to have created the science of Egyptology at the point of a bayonet. In 1797, revolutionary France was under the control of the Directoire, and Napoleon Bonaparte, having saved the revolution, had taken charge of the army in Italy and returned a conqueror. The Directoire was interested in turning Napoleon's attentions again outside of the home territory. On July 1st, 1798, after seizing the island of Malta, after just 2 days fighting and putting an end to the rule of the Knights of St. John, once the feared defenders of the soft Mediterranean underbelly of Christendom, Napoleon proceeded to advance on Egypt. He took in hand the treasures of the knights, and with his 35,000-strong French forces landed at Alexandria. At the Battle of the Pyramids on July 21st, 1798, the French crushed the Mamluks, the so-called Muslim slave soldiers of primarily East European origin, who controlled Egypt and ignored, for the most part, the overlordship of the Sultan in Constantinople. Pointing to the distant pyramids of Giza and guessing their date uncommonly well, Napoleon appeared to his men's sense of destiny and glory by exhorting them, "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The remnants of the Mamluk cavalry fled south up the Nile, inciting local villagers to come out and unwittingly protect their flanks against the French. A large French force indeed headed south in pursuit on August 25th. Napoleon had not only invaded Egypt militarily, however, but intellectually. Napoleon foresaw not only an economic and military imperial expansion of France, but set out single-handedly to create the modern and scientific study of Egypt. With the French military force went an army of savants, scholars from all fields. Perhaps most colorfully amongst them, the artist Dominique Vivant Denon, one-time court favorite and well-known pornographic etch artist. Soon, Denon and those assigned to ornithology or geology or other pursuits were neglecting their primary purposes in order to record antiquities and ancient inscriptions. The hardships and dangers were considerable, but the savants continued to work, sometimes under the sniping fire of Mamelukes. And Egyptology, at its birth, goes back to the place of the final death of the hieroglyphic script in the ancient cult, the island of Philae. There, in the far south, none other than the pornographer-turned-Egyptologist Denon convinced the French general Desaix to attack and hold the island of Philae, relatively unimportant militarily, just so Denon could take 3 days to copy inscriptions and scenes. By then, the French were already militarily doomed. On August 1st, 1798, less than 2 weeks after the Battle of the Pyramids, disaster struck the French fleet. A British squadron commanded by Horatio Nelson found the undermanned French vessels chained together and strung out along the beach in the rather bad anchorage of Abu Qir Bay in the north. The French Admiral Brueys believed attack from the landward side was impossible. Nelson, however, believed otherwise, and events proved Nelson correct. The British fleet split into 2 lines ahead, attacked the French from either side. Around 10 p.m., the culminating event of the battle occurred with the explosion of the French flagship L'Orient that took with it, no doubt, no inconsiderable amount of the treasure of the Knights of St. John. The Napoleonic expedition is directly responsible for the final intensive burst of effort leading to the translation of the native ancient Egyptian scripts. In 1799, just before the second battle of Abu Qir Bay, the unsuccessful Turkish attempt at invading French-controlled Egypt, a French officer of engineers by the name of François Bouchard discovered the greater portion of a copy of a Ptolemaic Egyptian bilingual decree built into the wall of a fort, Saint-Julien, in the delta town of Rosetta. This stone we know more commonly as the Rosetta Stone. Recognizing the potential importance of the stone, Bouchard notified his superiors. The text on the stone was written in Greek, late cursive Egyptian, we call that Demotic, and hieroglyphic Egyptian. Ultimately, with the French surrender in Egypt, and after a petulant French general Menu apparently tried to hide the stone, the object was identified and authenticated by the British diplomat and art expert William Hamilton, soon to be husband of Emma Hamilton, the latter soon thereafter to become the mistress of Admiral Nelson. Everything in ancient Egypt and Egyptology is very nicely and almost inextricably intertwined like this. The stone went to Egypt on HMS L'Egyptienne. The French had made rubbings of the stone, however. After important work by a number of scholars, including the British physicist Thomas Young, the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, guessing the language of the ancient scripts to be earlier forms of the Coptic language, succeeded in 1822 in discovering the dual ideographic and phonetic nature of the ancient Egyptian scripts. From 1822, finally, we have been able to read the ancient scripts again. Ancient Egyptian is the oldest writing system to survive with a true phonetic aspect. We have inscriptions already by 3250 BCE that are clearly Egyptian, predating anything other than actual pictographs in Mesopotamia, and with Coptic productive through the 14th century of our era, we now can read over 46 centuries of ancient Egyptian writing. Following what we might call this initial heroic Napoleonic period, Egyptological research divides roughly into three phases. The first phase is about 1815 to 1850, the age of collecting. This was a time of the bringing of actual monuments out of Egypt, sometimes in a rather rough and ready fashion, and to the collecting, the copying of scenes and inscriptions. After the French left, a man named Muhammad Ali took over the country. An Albanian Mameluke, Muhammad Ali understood the problems of the anarchic Mamluk rule and promptly eliminated all the surviving Mamluks on whom he could lay his hands. He opened Egypt up to Western influence, and a number of adventurers came into Egypt. One of these is one of the most colorful characters of early Egyptology, Giovanni Battista Belzoni. His life can be taken as exemplary in a way, although one hates to use the term exemplary, for those in this initial age of collecting. Born in Padua in 1778 and having performed as a circus strongman, calling himself the Patagonian Samson, Belzoni impressed an agent of Muhammad Ali with the design for a new sort of water pump. In 1815, he went to Egypt. His hydraulics career was something of a failure, but soon archaeology captivated him. Not long thereafter, Belzoni met the British Consul General Henry Salt, for whom he would collect numerous objects of Egyptian art. In fact, many of the masterpieces of the British Museum, and certainly many of the largest Egyptian objects in the British Museum, are due directly to the labors of Belzoni. Belzoni also made a number of discoveries that were not all pure accident. He wasn't simply a rough and ready strongman. Destruction, however, was in the air. Belzoni describes collections of objects that he had made being destroyed by rival collectors. One French proto-Egyptologist being one of the greatest vandals, according to Belzoni. Belzoni describes searching for papyri amongst the mummy-choked burials of western Thebes, of roaming through areas, quote, surrounded by bodies, by heaps of mummies in all directions. Once, quote, he sought a resting place, found one, and contrived to sit. But when my weight bore on the body of an Egyptian, it crushed like a bandbox. I naturally had recourse to my hands to sustain my weight, but they found no better support, so that I sunk altogether among the broken mummies with a crash of bones, rags, and wooden cases, and raised such a dust as kept me motionless for a quarter of an hour, waiting till it subsided again. Belzoni had no real sense of smell, apparently, but he said he could taste that the mummies were not pleasant to swallow. At the same time as the collection of monumental art for the museums of Europe, epigraphic collectors visited the country. Christophe, Champollion himself, Rossellini, and of course the great Prussian expedition led by Richard Lepsius made copies of Egyptian inscriptions and scenes that to this day remain indispensable for Egyptology. Much was being destroyed at this time, and these early copies are often all we have left. Champollion himself counted 40 complete ancient structures destroyed between 1814 and 1828. Christophe hurriedly drew a scene of Akhenaten at Karnak just before the natives broke it up for saltpeter. Napoleonic expedition members recorded the birth house of the Temple of Armant, a structure built by Cleopatra VII, Cleopatra the Great. They only were able to record it in a very summary fashion, and soon thereafter it was torn down to build its stones into a sugarcane refinery. The second phase of Egyptology, 1850 to 1881, sees people, and one person in particular, try to do something to stem this growing tide of destruction and wholesale exporting of objects. Champollion himself asked Muhammad Ali in 1828 to protect a list of 43 sites. In 1850, the Frenchman Auguste Mariette went to Egypt to look for the Serapeum, the burial ground of the sacred bulls called Apis. He indeed found that site in 1853 and discovered that he had an almost exclusive taste for fieldwork in Egypt. He wanted to do something to protect the monuments and wanted to create an antiquity service in Egypt. Prince Napoleon, cousin of Napoleon III, planned a trip to Egypt, and Said Pasha in Egypt wanted to present him a collection of antiquities. Ferdinand Lesseps of Suez Canal fame suggested that Mariette form the collection. Mariette indeed collected the antiquities. Prince Napoleon did not come, and Lesseps thereafter suggested, and Said Pasha fortunately agreed, that Mariette be named Directeur des Travaux d'Antiquité en Égypte. This was the beginning of the official Egyptian government antiquity service. Really the oldest modern antiquity service in the world. Mariette built this up until his death in 1881, when he was succeeded by Gaston Maspero. One anecdote will illustrate the peculiar dangers to Egypt brought on by unrestricted collecting, when the collectors were not as enlightened as Champollion or even Belzoni, and the resulting necessity for the service Mariette set up. At Drabon Naga on western Thebes, the tomb of the warrior queen Ahotep was found around the middle of the 19th century. Jewelry from the tomb appeared in Paris as part of the Egyptian exhibit in the Exposition Universelle de Paris in 1867. The Emperor Napoleon III let the Khedive of Egypt know that the Empress Eugénie really liked the jewelry, and suggested that Ismail ought to give some of it, if not all of it, to the Empress. Ismail very wisely said that, in fact, Auguste Mariette was in charge of such things, because Egypt had an antiquity service. Mariette, as a private individual and head of the antiquity service to boot, was able to say no. The jewels returned to Egypt, and Napoleon III apparently developed a very strong antipathy towards Mariette. Fortunately for Mariette, the Franco-Prussian War came along. The Prussians took Paris, and Mariette no longer had to worry about the wrath of Napoleon III. Finally, the third phase of infant Egyptology, roughly 1881 to 1931, sees the foundation of the modern study of the language of ancient Egyptian grammar and the actual birth of modern archaeology in Egypt. Two men may be said to typify this period: Edouard Naville, 1844 to 1926, and William Flinders Petrie, 1853 to 1942. They were quite different people. Naville was an excellent philologist who prepared a version of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead that we still use today, but he was a somewhat rough and ready archaeologist. He was given the Herculean task of clearing the temple of Deir el-Bahri on western Thebes, the great mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. It was covered by the remains of a Coptic monastery and Greco-Roman activity in the area. Naville, needing to copy the scenes and the inscriptions in Hatshepsut's temple, promptly brought in a small gauge railway and began to cart off what was left of the Coptic monastery, not always recording everything quite the way he should, although his epigraphic record of the scenes and the inscriptions at Deir el-Bahri is one of the best of such records we have in Egyptology. William Flinders Petrie possessed no great language ability, to say the least. He was apparently once physically evicted from a language class by a professor. Petrie initially went to Egypt to measure the Great Pyramid, hoping to prove the esoteric theories of Piazzi Smyth. In the end, Petrie's scientific approach to the question soon demolished Smyth's so-called metric bases for his imagined prophetic pyramid measurements, and Petrie, in fact, ended up developing the system of ceramic seriation we use in archaeology today, thereby extending an understanding of the development of material culture and iconography back before the first written records, essentially making prehistory not quite so mutely prehistoric. The American archaeologist George Andrew Reisner is a pioneer in the use of photography in recording archaeological work. These people set the basis for the modern study of all of the antiquities, the physical remains, and written inscriptions of ancient Egypt. And it is thanks to them, and to a great extent thanks to Napoleon Bonaparte, that we know most of the things about which I will speak in the remaining lectures. In the next lecture, we will examine the physical land of Egypt and the remote origins of Egyptian culture in the unique African Neolithic.
This ends Lecture 1.